Hello and welcome to Nightmare Tonight. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this episode, I have with me Liz Ryerson. Liz is an artist, a musician, a writer. We talked about a lot of stuff, but mainly it was focusing on this subculture of doom modding, which if you don't know what that is, we'll get into it. Liz is featured in an episode of Preserving Worlds on Means TV. If you recall, last week I interviewed Derek and Mitchell, the filmmakers behind Preserving Worlds, so check that out as well. Liz also has a podcast called The Blood Zone. Strongly recommend you check that out. I am featured on one of the episodes, so yeah. I want to talk about the modding community with Doom. I had this loose understanding that there was a community, but I really had no idea until I watched your YouTube channel that there was such a wide variety of these different maps. What initially got you interested in this sort of thing?
You know, I grew up playing computer games. Yeah, I grew up with, I guess my family at some point, we got a computer. So at some point in the 90s, we had some shareware games preloaded onto the computer. This was, I guess, the DOS era, and a lot of the Apogee games, which I guess later became 3D Realms. But the game that I was really into that I saw at my friend's house, I saw him playing, was Commander Keen 4, in particular, which was the shareware version. But anyway, because of that, I was really into id Software, which I called ID Software. We also had Wolfenstein, and I was really into Wolfenstein. So I think it just translated over to Doom. My friend at some point in elementary school had Doom on his computer, and I probably shouldn't have been playing it at that age, but it was way too scary for me. But yeah, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. So we eventually bought it. The Ultimate Doom,
right,
which was the retail version of the first Doom, and I was into that for a while. I started to get a little older, and I started to get PC Gamer magazine in the late 90s. And they had an issue about Quake modding. And I didn't have Quake, but I was like, well, if people are doing this with Quake, and are they doing this with Doom? Because I actually do own that game. And I looked up, and that's when I kind of discovered the id Games archive, which is the primary archive of Doom WADs, as they're called. Stands for Where's All the Data.
Love that.
Yeah. And yeah, most Doom WADs, they tend to be based off of Doom 2 instead of Doom 1. So I couldn't play a lot of the Doom 2, WADs until later. But, I played some of the recommended Doom 1 WADs, which were fairly early on levels that people had made. But yeah, this is one thing that with Doom, I think id Software they had seen that people were modding Wolfenstein, and which I also did as a kid, because it was actually much easier to do than make Doom maps, because Wolfenstein 3D, it's flat, there's no variation in height on the maps. So the map is just a 64 by 64 square. Basically looks in the Preserving World series, it looks like ZZT if you just looking at a Wolfenstein 3D map. But it's it was kind of hard to do that, because they had it's not hard, but it's hard to distribute that, because they had everything separated out into different files, the visual, the graphics, the maps, et cetera. So they structured the WAD files in order so that you could just plop a new WAD file on top of the base one, and it would just add whatever new elements to the game, so you can really easily play it. The game didn't ship with an editor or anything like that because I think it just wasn't technologically feasible, because they made the Doom maps on they use this thing called the Next Step computer, which was like Steve Jobs' company after he left Apple, before he came back to Apple in the 90s. And that's what they use to actually like design Doom. So a lot of the early Doom modding tools, like level creator tools, there were a bunch of different ones. They're not always great, so I think there's like a certain level of like amateurishness to a lot of the early Doom maps, but then there are some that feel kind of like the base game. But the scene in the 90s was kind of a big deal because and a lot of this stuff was all distributed on like places like CompuServe or things like that. But there were also some modders who were kind of coming together and trying to make more ambitious WADs. And I think like the first one of the first levels that I showed is from a set in the Preserving World is from a set called Memento Mori 2, which was one of the early Doom 2 mega WADs that people still kind of play. Like they're still very approachable, still pretty well designed.
That's the one with the Nin pattern, right?
Yeah, the 9-inch nail. Because I imagine it came out. I think it came out the same year as Quake, like that did. I think it came out in '96. So it makes sense. And because Trent Reznor did the sound design and music for Quake,
right?
Quake 1. After a certain point, like some of those people actually got hired, either to work for like Ion Storm when John Romero left, or they got hired to work at just various game jobs, working on other like first person shooters, etc. A few people ended up working for Valve. There's two brothers who made a commercial set called in the final Doom. It's like was a commercial release that was made by Doom modders. That was like it's called the Plutonia episode. It's split into two episodes, and there's like the TNT episode and the Plutonia episode. But one of the two designers of the Plutonia episode ended up working on Half-Life 1 and 2 as a level designer. Anyway, after a certain point, like that whole wave passed, and then Doom modding sort of changed into a second phase, which is what I talked about with the set Alien Vendetta, which is like I didn't play Doom 2 modding until a little bit later. I think I pirated a copy of Doom 2 because I never actually had played Doom 2 at all. And then I played this set called Alien Vendetta, which is probably one of the most famous quote unquote mega WADs, which is like a full replacement of Doom 2. So it's like 32 maps. Very ambitious.
For sure.
But yeah, and that's the kind of default format, for better or for worse, sometimes for worse, is the mega WAD in the Doom community. Even today, maybe less so today, but it still is. There's a whole bunch of like, prestige around a single person or like, 2-person mega WAD because it's an incredible amount of work. That means that there's often like a lot of filler and, things like that. But Alien Vendetta was like a community mega WAD, which is often the case. Like, but those Memento Mori episodes are also community driven. They're like, a bunch of different authors. And that one was just like particularly ambitious. It still used the default Doom engine, which, by the way, like at some point in the late 90s, they had released id Software. I think John Carmack released the Doom source code. So people came in and they kind of, changed it so that it disabled a lot of the weird limitations that were sort of built around old DOS computers. So, you didn't have these like limits to the amount of like sectors, what they're called, or like line defs, which are just like the, one section of wall. It's like a line or, or vertices or things like that. And you didn't have weird errors that you would get like for having too much sectors in one area, which was called a visplane overflow error. So that was disabled. And so there's like a split with the Doom community between quote unquote vanilla WADs that still use the original limitations and like, what they call limit removing, which uses, expanded engine limitations. So, but yeah, Alien Vendetta was I'm sorry, this is a very long-winded answer, but hopefully it's answering.
that you're touching on something that's pretty interesting to me, which is sort of like disagreements in a certain online subculture.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's been so many. But yeah, just to finish, Alien Vendetta was like a particularly ambitious set because it was a vanilla Doom Megawad, but it was very expansive. Like the levels are huge and quite difficult, but there was also an element of, there's a kind of aesthetically appealing, like there's a certain mood to a lot of the maps. And I think that created a whole archetypes for the Doom community, which is a lot of Doom WADs, especially the more famous ones that you play, especially more recent, for like the last 20 years, often have very difficult, heavy combat and big sort of expansive, grandiose environments that are very attractive looking. And those are often referred to as slaughter maps, which is like a kind of there are a few slaughter maps as you could describe them in Alien Vendetta, although it's not like fully that. But yeah, like that is kind of an archetype of like the Doom modding community. Like a lot of modding communities, a lot of the fan levels are very difficult, and I think sometimes kind of bloated and overly long and filled with kind of filler because people don't know exactly what to do with particular spaces. And that was like a particular trend, I feel like, in the aughts, where people are like, oh, I can like put all this detail into a hallway, and it's just like the map is just filled with like all these like copy pasted details, individual tiles like falling apart and stuff that they meticulously did with like sectors, and maybe it looks neat the first time, but when you're just copy pasting it everywhere, it just looks like it's like people were trying to imitate AAA games, that had an increasing amount of environmental detail. But then there was kind of like a backlash against that. But anyway, so there's been a lot of different phases of that community, and I think I just always have liked playing fan maps. I mean, it's the same way with playing like Super Mario World ROM hacks, or when I had Half-Life, I tried to play Half-Life user maps and things like that. It's just always fun to not only like that the game is like kind of just a launch pad for all this like further stuff that people are making. So you don't even just have the default experience, you have all this other stuff, which, if you're thinking in the mind of like a 10-year-old, I don't know how old I was when I like first discovered a lot of that stuff, 10 or 11-year-old, and your parents don't necessarily want to buy, more than one game. It's like, well, you're going to make it count, I want to buy the one game that has all these like user made levels attached to it.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. But also, I don't know, it's just fun to see the stuff that people make. And I just kind of kept doing, in college and etc. I just like, listen to music and play through Doom 2 WADs. It's just like a mindless thing to do. So I just kind of followed it off and on. And I haven't really super actively participated in the community. I did finally like release one map as part of like a larger set a couple years ago, but I'm not like super central to the community. And I think my perspective is more informed by kind of me being more attached to the quote unquote indie game universe.
Sure.
Which I got into like 10 or so years ago, and more like art, ambitious arty kind of stuff. So I think when I started to get into more ambitious arty games, I kind of went back into Doom, and I was like, well, is there a version of that people are trying to do with Doom maps?
Right.
And that's when I discovered Alt, which I talk about in Preserving Worlds. And I wrote this big piece about the set called Alt, which is by a Russian/Ukrainian group of modders, level creators. But anyway, that's my very long-winded answer.
Well, what's the angle with alt? It's a bit more unusual, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are several more arty levels and more arty sets, but what I liked about alt was that it's very much a people who are not necessarily immersed in Doom or the Doom community coming in and basically just trying to transpose their own ideas for a game or creative ideas onto a Doom mod.
Yeah.
Kind of awkwardly in a lot of places, but they're trying to actually tell a story, which, like, in alt, you're in a plane crash, and in the first level, you're in a plane, and then the second level, you're in the sort of crash site. And then it goes on from there, but it's very surreal. It's very like psychological horror type thing. Alt is a full megawatt. It's a full 32 levels, and not every level is great. I mean, it dips like in a few places, but for the most part, it's remarkably consistent, and every level feels different from the last one. I mean, there's a general kind of cryptic, puzzly sensibility, but it's more also kind of combat oriented and a little more accessible than some of the other more heavily cryptic maps that I played. So it just like combines a lot of things that are really that you would just not see combined in a user created set anywhere, like that. I haven't really seen anything like it. I mean, they did make a previous set called Sacrament, which is pretty similar. It's like 11 or 12 maps, which I also show a map from in the Preserving Worlds episode.
That's the one that's like a nightmare, right?
Yeah, you're walking around. The first level is like you have a nightmare, things turn hellish, and then you wake up in the same building, and then you walk around, you're in this giant city, and it's mostly exploration based. You're just trying to find a certain number of keys in order to unlock an area. So and the level feels kind of like a Deus Ex, the game Deus Ex. It kind of feels like that. You're just wandering around this kind of this city at night. And the music, like they use a non-MIDI music. They steal it from like an anime or something. I don't know what it's from exactly, but there's a really good mood to that. And of course, like with any community, there's like, you can really tell the distinctive style of each mapper, especially, if they make multiple things, because usually it's just one person making a map. Sometimes it's like two people, but oftentimes it's just one person. And that was, that's the archetype set out by Doom 1 and Doom 2. Almost most of the maps are primarily made by, if not entirely made by, one person.
Yeah.
And you can really tell the difference in styles. And that's one thing that I actually really like. And it's not just a Doom community thing. I started following Quake modding a little bit, Quake 1 modding a little bit too. And I mean, there's similar thing there of like, you play a set because you're excited by one particular author's maps and you want to see what they're going to do next because you like their style. But if you compare that to like the way that individual designers made one map, that went away in the industry basically once the 2000s sort of happened, because the scope and scale of games expanded a lot, and you started having environmental artists who and the way that who like added details and stuff, and the way that maps in a lot of those games are designed is kind of different now. So there is kind of like an auteur, a little bit, sensibility of individual map designers, which is something I really like. And I don't feel like you get it from, big AAA games. And of course, for indie games, like a game that just somebody makes that they put on itch.io or on or they try to sell on Steam, like could be anything. And there's something nice about just having the template of Doom and seeing how people work within those limitations. To me, maybe just because I'm used to playing Doom because I've been playing it for so long, but
yeah. So you alluded to certain maybe internal disagreements amongst this particular subculture with the whole like vanilla versus this other version that
Limit removing. Yeah.
Are there any other interesting examples of that?
Oh yeah, there's lots. I mean, the Doom modding community is pretty big. Like, it's one of the bigger modding communities, I'd say, in general, but especially for an older game. I don't really have a good sense of like how to compare it to another one, but it is quite big. I mean, like, part of the thing with the Preserving Worlds episode is I saw, like, some of the other episodes where they were like, tons of people in those communities were like excited about the Preserving Worlds episode, whereas the Doom thing was probably just a tiny blip. Because I mean, there are big YouTubers that cover Doom modding, Doom maps and all that kind of stuff. It's a much bigger audience. Even though it's still niche, it's a much bigger audience than a lot of other things. Yeah, in terms of divisions, so there was a big split that started in the 2000s when a program called ZDoom came about, which is more the version everyone uses now is called GZ Doom. And that's like one of the biggest Doom ports. That's one of the biggest ports because it's compatible with like almost anything. You can run it on almost anything. It's really easy, which is part of the thing that's great about Doom modding. I mean, you can run it on a Mac. You can do that stuff, which is not always the case with a lot of things. And there was a big split between people who were more interested in the vanilla experience or something close to it, which is what limit removing is. Like, maybe remove some limitations. Maybe it uses what is called the boom engine, which is pretty close to limit removing. It just adds a few features, but it was something that came about before ZDoom. Or there are also other people who are doing like full, mods where they're changing, they're adding new features. They're doing ZDoom has scripting, like a scripting feature. So they're doing all kinds of scripting. They might be adding cutscenes. They might be doing all kinds of visual stuff. They might just be making an entirely new kind of feeling game out of it. And there's also kind of there's a Doom multiplayer community as well.
Yep.
Which is also kind of separate in a lot of ways. So I guess there's definitely a big split between ZDoom and the Doom world. And the Doom world side is bigger, and I tend to follow that stuff more, which is, so I already have, maybe inherent biases there in terms of what I was covering. It's kind of hard to cover a community that's as big as that.
Yeah, right. I always love it when you come across some of the more, I don't know what you'd call them, like purists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I assume, I assume there are proponents of like the vanilla, and they feel very strongly about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so what happened with that split is that, between ZDoom and more vanilla limit removing kind of classic quote unquote megawad people, is that there's this perception that a lot of the ZDoom stuff was kind of cheap and janky and kind of amateurish in a lot of ways because people are trying to do, so much, and the aesthetics are maybe not necessarily very great. And there's just a lot of like kind of, regrettable stuff. But and I think the perception with on the more purist side is that, I just like the default kind of action and approach to design of Doom.
Right.
And I kind of want to stick more to that. And that was me more. But even like in around 2010, a set called Doom the Way It Did came out, where there were some people who were really intense purists who were like, okay, we're going to design exactly, we're going to try to replicate the styles of the original designers, like as, accurately as possible, which is an interesting experiment, really. But those people, some of the people in that group could be quite intense. And, we're not always very open to different approaches to level design. Like a lot of those levels, a lot of those people kind of adopted because they were kind of reacting against the bloat and the like, let's make, hyper detailed hallways to a more like, let's go back to basics. Let's stick to the combat. Let's have like, it concentrated more on things like flow and things like that. But it also means like a lot of those people really hated a set like Alt because it does have some kind of new things to it. It doesn't quite feel like a Z-Doom set, but there's some elements of that. And the design just sensibility does not mesh really at all with, the kind of hyper minimalist, quote unquote, elegant style. So I think that's one of the reasons why Alt was kind of ignored outside of the Russian Doom community, which had its own kind of hub and culture and, was Russian speaking.
Yeah.
There's a Russian speaking Doom hub, and a few of those people do post on Doom World, but there are some differences in just the internal culture of those things. So yeah, there's a lot of like little and of course there's the multiplayer community, and there's a lot of in the Preserving World series, in the version that there's a bonus episode that if you're a subscriber to Means TV, you'll see that the default series is for free. You can watch it for free, even if you're not a subscriber. But yeah, there's a bonus episode where they go through some of the multiplayer Doom wads, and there's one that's like a multiplayer Mega Man based Doom wad, and there's a whole like hotel lobby kind of area, and kind of a chill space and all that kind of stuff. So there's some there's some of that even that exists on particular parts of the Doom community. I know there was a big Sonic Doom wad that was like popular for a long time. Somebody made there's a DOS game called Hocus Pocus, which like, you only really know if you played those Apogee games, but somebody made a full like conversion Doom mod of it, where they upscaled the graphics and they used all the enemies from the game. And it is like 2 or 3 times better than the actual game that it's based off of, which is amazing to me. But there's also a Castlevania Doom. There's some stuff like that. And some of those are pretty good. I think the quality has gone up from a lot of those projects. And I think as like indie games and stuff become more popular, people start to get more understanding of how to embrace limited kind of aesthetics and really make something that feels like its own experience without, just trying to mirror like AAA tropes or whatever.
There's I guess this aspect of Doom modding that I really appreciate, which is like it's kind of like an inherently constrained thing, and that can actually foster creativity as opposed to like curtailing it,
Yeah. Well, and one big thing that John Romero, famously of id Software, who was one of the 2 or 3 designers on Doom 1 and Doom 2. He designed almost all of the first episode of Doom, which is a lot of people's favorite. That was the shareware episode, that was widely distributed, and a lot of people have played if they played anything with Doom. He left id Software after Quake, and he had a whole disaster with Ion Storm and the game Daikatana. And at some point, I don't know, he came back to trying to do Doom modding, and he actually made a set called Sigil fairly recently, a few years ago. I think just a couple years ago, actually. And one of the creators of the original game coming back and doing a fan mod, it's just like, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's insane.
It's just not a thing that, it isn't really a thing. So it's kind of amazing that happened, and that he was very supportive of it. He didn't do a Quake mod, and what he said specifically is that he felt like Doom was a good space in between something like Wolfenstein 3D, where you have to project so much into what the environment is, and you have to read so much into it because it's very simple, and something like Quake, which is really starting to get into like a true 3D engine, and the tools were they're still simple relatively simple compared to a lot of modern stuff. But in comparison, Doom is a lot more streamlined, and you can do relatively ambitious things pretty quickly. It's kind of optimized for that. So I think that's part of the reason. And the game still, feels good to play. It's a pretty fast game. The movement, first person shooters have become so ubiquitous that it's kind of a vocabulary that a lot of people just have now.
Yeah.
So I think that has a lot to do with it. And, Doom was the game that launched id Software and launched first person shooters for better or for worse. And yeah, for me, that's like, that's something that's kind of bittersweet, but it's because, first person shooters as a trope have a lot of things that are not great attached to them. And I'm not talking about like the school shooter stuff, because I think that that's exaggerated,
Right.
but I'm talking more about like the military Call of Duty type shooters, where
God.
they get money from the US Army to like, or, arms manufacturers and things like that. That's a whole pipeline. So yeah. And like the creativity of a lot of AAA games, which are really just heavily based off of like now a kind of mush of like first person shooter and like exploration RPG tropes that kind of just got all mashed together into the generic AAA game experience now. And it's been that way for like 15 years, I'd say. And it feels like an unchanging monolith of awful a lot of times.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping like Cyberpunk would I don't know.
But Cyberpunk is the most one of those kind of games that I can think of.
It is the epitome of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, which is I think why there was a backlash to it, because people expected more from that game.
I foolishly did. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at something like Breath of the Wild, it does have a lot of those kind of features to it, but it's a little different, or games like Resident Evil 7 or 8 or the 2 remake, they're a little more niche, or like the Hitman games, those are a little more, they have maybe an open world component, but those are a little more niche and like limited. But the real like, Fallout, Far Cry, Bethesda game, kind of Assassin's Creed games are kind of similar. Like a lot of that stuff all kind of is just, or GTA is all just kind of a mush in some ways, in terms of a lot of the approaches are all kind of very similar to each other. And I think, with Cyberpunk, people are finally, well, at least for that brief moment, I don't know if that will really change anyone's desire to, because the mainstream game industry, the AAA prestige game industry is like so kind of on this pipeline where they have a particular audience that's just going to continue to pay for those things.
And I think with Cyberpunk, the kind of problems with the launch overshadow the general problems with the game itself, in terms of its homogeneity, its total plainness, I guess I would say.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's also like, I mean, I thought like looking at all those compilations of glitches was actually really fun.
Yes, that was like the best part about that whole thing.
And some people were like, oh, LOL, this game is so broken. But like a year later, 2 years later, it's not going to be broken anymore.
Right.
It's still going to be kind of a bland experience in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On another note, this sort of interest we share in common of like online subcultures, you said something in Preserving Worlds that resonated with me. You said that people gravitate towards these kinds of communities because it enables them to express something that maybe they feel like they can't express in their everyday lives. Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I feel like that's covered even better in a lot of the other episodes of Preserving Worlds, especially the Second Life one, which you can watch for free on Means TV. The person who's interviewed for that is like anonymous. They're a trans woman, which I also am, but I didn't really talk about any identity stuff at all in the Doom episode because I've been over that stuff a million times. But they just talk about how this woman talks about how she discovered that she was trans basically through playing Second Life, and through kind of thinking of like what she felt comfortable with in terms of gender expression and, what she wanted her avatar to be. And that kind of helped her figure out that she was trans. Of course, and a game like Second Life is kind of explicitly designed for people to kind of, get out some desires that they can't get out normally. There's a lot of sex stuff in Second Life. A lot of furry stuff is the dominant really component. But the other thing about Second Life is it's much more kind of dark in a lot of ways than a lot of the other communities that are covered in Preserving Worlds, because it's hyper capitalist.
Yes.
It actually feels far more cyberpunk than Cyberpunk 2077. Because it's like every space is commodified and you have to pay for, I don't know. It's really kind of weird and kind of disturbing.
Yep.
But then there are also elements of good to it. But yeah, a lot of those communities, especially a community like that, or like Worlds Chat, which they also have an episode on, which is an old 90s, MMO type experience, except more minimalist, is or VR Chat, I guess, is the current example of that kind of experience that's actually quite popular.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's an element of that's more explicit there of, personal expression, personal freedom, things like that are, especially we're very big on the internet of the 90s, were something that were kind of advertised as like you're judged by, the content of what you say or the content of your ideas and not who you are in meat space,
Right.
And there were a lot of problems and issues with that. A lot of, online communities that I'm sure that you've been a part of, or I've been a part of, there's a lot of insularity, a lot of, bullying, and a lot of pretty intense toxic conflicts, in a lot of those spaces. So it's certainly not and a lot of spaces can be not so friendly to outsiders. So you do kind of have to get into a certain mode to really fit into some of these communities. But at the same time, because it's like a lot of these spaces, Doom as an example, it's not commodified. I mean, if you're making a Doom WAD, some people have made like commercial games based off of the Doom engine, but it's pretty rare. If you're making a Doom WAD, I'm sure there's some self-promotion aspect that goes into it, like anything these days, but it's not commercial, just by default, because it's just based off of the default Doom. So you have to own the default Doom in order to play it. And so like it's just not commodified. So that you're making something for this community, and you're making something just with the purpose of personal expression, or maybe you want to be cool within this community, but it's like much lower stakes than like, when I got into indie games, which is like, oh, you could literally be a millionaire, or you could be a broke person that no one cares about. It's such a huge fucking range, and it's like a massive amount of pressure. And it's, versus something like a Doom modding community, which is like, if you make something that not a lot of people notice, it's not that big of a deal, and it's just lower stakes. And there's something, because the market is not a factor there's something really nice about it. And I think that is kind of kept it from being soiled, maybe in the way that a lot of spaces that become marketized do. And I'm not saying that there haven't been, phases of, not so good things and all that kind of stuff. And it's through the efforts of individual people who are running, the Doom WAD archive, who are running Doom World. This guy, Linguiça, has run Doom World since like 1999. I've actually met him in person, and we talked. I had an old podcast called Beyond the Filter that I talked to him on. But it's through the efforts of a lot of those people, and all the people who are into the community that are why it's continued to exist. But it is like, to me, like, when I was going through a lot of insanity with the indie game stuff of people, really intensely like clout chasing and kind of like trying to establish themselves as the next big thing so that they could make a lot of money and be famous for that in the future. The following something like Doom modding and just kind of putting your head down and just downloading some of these things and just being like, well, what's out there? It's just a lower stakes feeling to me.
Yeah, it's
And
refreshing.
yeah. Yeah. And it's like something that the internet used to have a lot more of. It still has some of, there's still aspects of it that exist.
Right.
But because of social media and things like Twitter, not just even Twitter, but especially Twitter, it is really everything's about promotion and kind of, trying to be an influencer, be the next big person. Even, things like TikTok and stuff, people become established TikTokers, and then they go and move in a house, like an influencer house in LA and all that kind of crap.
Yeah.
And
dystopian.
it's dystopian. And that's what like kids are growing up with now. That's these like heavily marketized space where it's like you put everything about yourself online, you put your real name online. There's no kind of element of having like an alter ego or, performance element of something different. It's so based on that. And and we're all just basically commodities for these companies in order for them to keep, going and keep running. It's like you really sell yourself to Twitter or you sell yourself to Facebook more so than really anything else. And maybe you get some money back out of that, like I have a Patreon. I think you do too as well, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like, we invest into Twitter or any of these other YouTube, any of these other spaces with the hope that, we'll see money coming in through Patreon and stuff. And sometimes that happens, so that's good, but it's still like, there's something, I think when money comes into stuff, it like inherently, when it's the capitalist market, laissez-faire kind of setup, it inherently just changes dynamics of spaces in a way where they're just not amenable to the kinds of dynamics that exist in these communities and the kinds of like occasional glimpses of utopianism that you can see from some of these things.
Yeah, it's like alienating in the Marxist sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, people are alienated from their own labor. Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about. So you talk about. I can't remember what the name of the level is. The map set. You talk about this level where everything is like constantly shifting around and the rules are changing. And you mentioned how it reminds you of the Zone in Stalker, and you referenced HyperNormalisation. I was wondering if you had a chance to watch Adam Curtis's new documentary series yet.
I have not.
Yeah.
I didn't actually know that it came out yet.
I think you can only... Oh, you know what? He uploaded some episodes on his YouTube channel. But there was a week there where it was only on BBC's website, so you couldn't really access it as an American, which I was searching around for other sources. But I did appreciate that, the hypernormalization reference. I mean, go ahead.
Oh no, ask, please ask.
I was just going to say I have mixed feelings about Adam Curtis, but in general, like it's an event whenever something of his comes out for me.
Totally. I feel the same way. I have a friend who had some issues with hypernormalization, didn't like it because they felt like it misrepresented some aspects of Soviet life, like late Soviet, which I think is probably true. I mean, but I think it's more like he's using all this like old footage that he has access to in order to communicate something just about an underlying dynamic or emotional feeling or idea that might motivate a lot of things that are happening in society and in culture. And he has another one called "All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace" from 2011, which I watched that one, and that one very much concerns the tech industry and what is called the California ideology, and that kind of comes into the utopianism, but like a marketized utopianism that was built into kind of the rebranding of the tech industry in the 90s, especially a lot of ex-hippies, really investing heavily in tech. With hypernormalization, I think, yeah, the intent of that is to just like describe a certain dynamic, which I feel like I'm feeling even more now than when now that Trump has left,
Yeah.
in a weird way, because Trump was like so like the commentary around people being like Trump is gaslighting us and all this kind of stuff. It's like you have an obvious evil, an avatar for badness and things that like people don't like and don't support, that
Yeah. Everything was like an urgent crisis.
yeah, which I kind of just, I got burned out with after, 2017 really. I think yeah, after that 1 year of just the new crises every 10 seconds. I mean the crises continued, but like I stopped following it as much after that point. But
It's too much for one mind to experience.
yeah, and it's also like it's so reductive, and you can see that. You can see the side effects of that happening, the hangover or whatever of that happening now with a lot of people. I don't know who these people are, but a lot of people defending Biden when he's doing next to nothing to change anything.
Yeah, hypernormalization is in full effect now.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a real dissonance that is becoming even more apparent to me between different parts of culture and between, concepts and norms that we might have been raised on, or, internalized versus the reality. And the dissonance feels stronger maybe than it's ever been.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I know that part of the whole counterculture of the 60s was about a dissonance, but also like the economy and stuff was doing well at that point in time, and there wasn't a pandemic. So
It's something where you can see like a clear difference between like liberals and leftists on this, because it's like liberals will say, I've heard the term like post-truth or like polarization. They'll talk about polarization a lot. But they usually, the sense in which they talk about it is like, that's the problem. This polarization is the problem. Whereas leftists are kind of more like, it's a symptom of a larger problem. It's a symptom of what capitalism is doing to society right now.
well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the commentary, most of the commentary, I feel like that gets spewed around, especially through more mainstream media channels, is like not only useless, but actually worse than useless, because I feel like it continually constructs an image or idea of reality that is harmful and in many ways, because it's based off of assumptions that if you are a left leaning person, but I would say pretty confidently, are not echoed by reality and are very much internalization of ideology. And yeah, with the hypernormalization, with the comparing that to this doom wad. So I wrote a piece in what was formerly Waypoint, I guess Vice Games or whatever it's called,
Mm-hmm.
about alt, that doom set, and then I compared it to hypernormalization. And I mentioned a bunch of other stuff. So I was talking about this set as part of a larger cultural dynamic and it capturing something. And I think the idea was like, well, if people in the doom modding community don't really appreciate this, I want to like have a way in which I can make an argument for this thing, which is much broader. And kind of the underlying idea of the argument is that there is all this stuff out there on maybe these niche communities or just random parts of the internet that might have some kind of insight or represent some kind of more accurate idea about where the world is and where it's headed, and who people are and all that kind of stuff that we just might not be seeing at all, because major media channels have become so consolidated. Things are so split into different zones, and the only thing that is visible to everyone is like Marvel movies or big AAA games, but almost everything else is kind of like just a matter of like if you're in a certain sphere to see it. So there are all these things, all these kinds of forms of expression that could very much go by the wayside if people don't understand the importance of like preserving them, which is and obviously a theme of preserving worlds. So, and to me, like I looked at in 2017, which is when the piece came out in like early 2018, but in 2017 when I wrote the piece, Zelda Breath of the Wild came out, and also the new Mario game, Super Mario Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess not the new Mario game, but the newest at that point, and the Switch came out, and there was just huge amounts of hype around that, and saying like Nintendo is successfully caught the zeitgeist or whatever. And to me, it's just like it was so obvious that I could see the limitations of what in those games. It's like this is as far as this company can really go, or they can't go much farther than this, because they can never be critical or reevaluate their IPs that they're so attached to, that their company depends upon this branding so strongly, that they can never have it not just be characters can't have certain traits and can't do things in a certain way, like past a certain point.
Yeah.
And when I'm comparing something like Alt to that, which is way more just going in way more different places and like kind of messing with the fourth wall in a lot of ways, and using just much more minimal tools in order to communicate something that is much deeper and stranger. It's just like, it's like where like this stuff is coming from. There's stuff out there, and like what if there are all these kind of new things and expressions that we're just kind of inherently missing because they're not taken seriously because they're part of some niche community. And I mean, I honestly think that the split between those things is becoming ever more apparent. I mean, you watch it like with the left media ecosystem and other things. Like there are certainly, podcasts and especially podcasts, but, people who have gotten quite big, but it's still not at the scale of scope or budget or success as anything, remotely like Hollywood-esque or
it's maybe something
and it is
bigger
like,
than a subculture, but still like it appeals to a certain demographic.
yeah, most people that I know who I talk to do not know what Chapo Trap House is.
Right.
Even though it is the number one thing on Patreon and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And what was I going to say? Yeah, I don't know. The whole argument with hypernormalization, I think I also mentioned it because in the context of that megawatt, because like, it's a Russian slash Ukrainian kind of team or whatever you want to call them. And there's some cultural sensibilities of sort of post-Soviet life that echo these things because they're internalized. There's kind of an unreality that is very deeply internalized in like cognitive dissonance in post-Soviet culture. And and it's kind of like the failure of a great big project, the failure of an empire in some ways, and the decay of those things and the breakdown of those things that used to be more of a motivating like force of society. And I mean, I feel like we're getting there here with capitalism. I feel like, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of Biden supporters still out there, I guess, but I even see people who are, on the liberal end being like, kind of like, I don't feel like this is going anywhere, like not really buying stuff already with this new president and with the whole kind of ecosystem. So I think that makes things like the cognitive dissonance between what is actually happening in the world and like what you're expected to do as a person in society is so enormously vast, especially during the pandemic, that dissonance is just so strong that there's eventually some kind of breaking point there.
Right.
Things have to change.
Yeah, and the thing I appreciate about Curtis is he often just points out that no one has a good, solid vision of the future that they want, or at least maybe those that do are relatively marginal figures, and you don't really hear from them. And that's, say what you will about the Soviet Union, but they did have a vision. they had a positive vision for the future. I was rewatching HyperNormalisation a couple of weeks ago, and there's this one part where it's just footage of this woman, and she's saying, she's just like, hope? There is no, what are you talking about, hope? Get out of here. Stop asking me these things. And it's like, we can, obviously, there's a parallel here between her demeanor and the rise of the doomer phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
It's
well, and also like, I mean, in the Soviet Union, like there was just so much corruption and like nepotism.
Yeah.
And all this stuff is like post Stalin. And I think for the first time, a lot, they're maybe more openly processing, the effects of Stalinism.
Yeah.
And the fact that, people were disappeared and, made to work in labor camps and executed for, just intense situation. And it's just economic problems in a lot of economic issues in the 70s and 80s. And I think that kind of, there's still a motivating force there that a lot of people buy into, but there's an increasing dissonance between the idea of what you are and how you function in society versus what is actually happening. And I mean, I think that's true with capitalism too, because the whole idea, especially American capitalism, but capitalism in general, the whole idea is, you have freedom to be an entrepreneur and do whatever and find new markets to exploit. And you are judged by your inherent cleverness or, ability to think outside the box and like, work your butt off in order to make your dreams a reality or whatever. I mean, that really had something that I kind of bought into with the whole indie games and tech boom, even of like 10 years ago, of like, oh, there's like innovation and new ideas, and that's what people value, and that's what's actually going to make money, but after a certain point, and of course there's still people who buy into that, like Elon Musk supporters, but like there's a dissonance between that as we realize like, oh, it wasn't really ever a meritocracy, actually maybe this isn't working at all, Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is related. I was listening to your latest episode of The Blood Zone, where at the beginning you talk about this sort of the pressures that lead people to kind of professionalize and increase their production values. That's something I really feel on my end as someone who makes stuff for YouTube.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to compare yourself to like ContraPoints now,
I know. Yeah. Which is impossible. There's no comparison. But I think about how, on the other hand, like some of my, like the videos of mine that have gone viral have terrible production values, at least in my opinion. So it's kind of a weird thing for me. You can't really predict these things.
Well, your videos about Petscop are I know are some of your more viewed ones, and I think that's just because you're one of the only people who's more extensively covering like a niche phenomenon.
Yep.
So you were kind of on the ground floor of that, to use that whole that whole logic. But I mean, that's how it works. I mean, I don't think I'd be like, Patreon is still my primary source of income. I don't make tons, but I do decently on there, and have for years. And part of the reason for that is I got in early, and that's the thing with these new platforms. Like, that's why artists are trying to do this NFT bullshit, non-fungible tokens.
Oh, what is that? I haven't heard of that.
It's like cryptocurrency based art. It's like the whole mindset of like rich people will invest in paintings because the idea is it's more stable than to invest in art than it is to invest in the market, because great art, theoretically does not depreciate in value in the same way. It's
the same argument people make with gold.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I know I've seen like people like Jay-Z especially like make this argument. It's like invest in paintings, or like artworks. Yeah. And so it just becomes an investment Like art is just this thing for rich people to own and invest in, like that's all it is. And I mean, the art world has been that way for years. It's unfortunately like it is just a venue for the rich at this point. But everything is kind of increasingly becoming like that.
Right.
And the whole idea with NFTs is it's like people bid on them and like you own a unique copy if you buy this thing. It's a unique digital copy, basically. So there's no one else. There's no one other thing like it. So, you're basically orienting your whole creative output towards one person with a lot of money who will want to buy your thing, which is the opposite of all these communities and stuff covered in Preserving Worlds it's the opposite of what I do. It's the opposite of what a lot of people I know who grew up online do, which is like, I put everything online for free and then you just give me money if you want to support me, because that's what I believe in, inherently. Like, I've sold like an album or something like that, for $5, but I don't mind if people pirate that,
Sure.
And if I'm selling physical goods, then I'll sell physical goods, but if we're talking about digital stuff, like most of the things that I want to do, I want them to be free and accessible to everyone, because that's just what that's what I grew up with.
And it's value. It's like like the more people see it, the better, right?
Yeah. Well, and I didn't have money as a kid, so like all the stuff that I was looking at was free.
Mm-hmm. This thing you're talking about, what's it called again? NFT and
non-fungible tokens.
Non-fungible
NFTs.
tokens. It sounds to me like just a reversion back to feudalism, where you have artists who rely on lords and just wealthy patrons, basically, right?
It might be worse in some ways because unlike with Patreon, or even unlike someone paying Leonardo da Vinci to paint the Sistine Chapel or whatever. I hope I didn't get those things mixed up. Whatever.
I think you got it.
Those are spaces that are theoretically like public spaces that a lot of people will see and enjoy. Whereas these non-fungible tokens are inherently limited. It's only for one person.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe a limited amount of copies. That is really dark to me. I just don't support that. But tons of people have jumped aboard that train, especially in the music world right now, because music is in a bad place because people make money from touring, and that obviously is not happening.
Well, that's a dark place to leave it, but you've been very generous with your time. You want to give me like a quick soundbite of where people can find you?
Yeah. So I have Twitter at ELLAGURO. My Patreon, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/ELLAGURO, Elaguro. I also just have a website that just has links to my social media and all that kind of stuff. So, and I have a podcast called The Blood Zone, which if you search for the Blood Zone podcast, or it's on, Libsyn is the main page. I obviously had you on an episode to talk about Petscop. Oh my goodness. And, but it's very sporadic. I don't it's not like it's a kind of a when I feel like it thing, because a lot of the episodes are longer and more edited. And
right. I was going to say, you don't put out episodes consistently, but when you do, they're like these long, sprawling things that are just perfect for I don't know, when I listen to them when I'm doing menial tasks at work, and it's just perfect for that.
Yeah, I like that because I did more of a monthly or bi-monthly podcast where I just interviewed people for a while called Beyond the Filter, and I eventually just kind of got bored of it, and I had a couple interviews with people who I hadn't really ever talked to before, and it was just awkward.
Sure. It's the same deal for me in this podcast, but it's like, you have a really good one, Beyond the Filter. You have a really good one with Matt Chrisman, right?
No, it's Felix Biederman of.
Oh shit, it's Felix. Okay, I get those two in particular mixed up, but it's about Something Awful, right?
Old online communities. Yeah, we talk about Something Awful. He's not from Something Awful, but he talks about the Game Spy forums that he was on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, that's a good one. I'll include a link in the description for that one. But yeah, Liz Ryerson, thank you. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk. And we'll leave it.
No problem.
Leave it there.